6th Annual Gerald H. Shofner Lecture on Florida Culture and History. Professor Shofner was a leader in Florida history, as well as a longtime chair of the UCF History Department, who did a lot to develop our programs. So we are honored to host this event in his honor and his memory. I would like to thank the Florida Historical Quarterly and the UCF chapter of Phi Alpha Theta National History Honor Society for sponsoring tonight's event. I also want to make sure students know tomorrow at 12 noon there will be a brown bag lunch with the speakers from tonight's event in room Trevor Coleman Hall, room 211. I'd also like to take a quick moment to recognize a few special guests here tonight. Ben Rothmarkel, the Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society, and Maurice O'Sullivan, Professor of English at Rollins College and a member of the Florida Historical Society Board. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Connie Lester, editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly and organizer of tonight's event. Connie Lester.
Good evening. Welcome to the 6th Annual Gerald Shofner Lecture on Florida History. Let me just say a few words about the lecture and its origins. The lecture series is an outreach of the Florida Historical Quarterly, which is the peer-reviewed scholarly publication of the Florida Historical Society. The offices for the quarterly are in the History Department at UCF. The Society headquarters are in Cocoa. The Florida Historical Quarterly is in its 97th year of publication and came to UCF from the University of Florida in the mid-1990s. Dr. Shofner was the first editor at UCF, and the lecture series was named to honor his contributions to Florida history, his work as editor, his scholarship, and his service as a past president of the Society. Dr. Shofner attended the first inaugural lecture in 2013, but unfortunately his health did not permit him to be present for any of the other lectures. On April the 11th, 2017, he passed away. Tonight's panel further honors Dr. Shofner by focusing on Reconstruction, the topic of his best-known book, Nor Is It Over Yet, Florida in the Era of Reconstruction, 1863 to 1877. I would also like to introduce Dr. Robert Casanello, an associate professor in the History Department and a scholar of Florida history. Dr. Casanello is the author of To Render Invisible, Jim Crow and Public Life in New South Jacksonville and co-editor of 2 volumes of essays. His award-winning work in public history includes curated exhibits and podcasts. Dr. Casanello will moderate the panel and will introduce the panel members. Thank you.
I understand this is the place to be at 5:30 on Monday, so all of you can have a good time. I'd like to start out and myself recognize 3 people who are in some way encountered. First, of course, is Joe Shofner, who the speaker series is named after. I'd like to also recognize Peter Larson, because soon after Gerald passed away, Peter and I were having a conversation, and he said, I'd really like us to do something as a department that recognizes the legacy of Gerald's scholarship that's more than just one speaker. And I said, oh, that's a great idea. Let me talk to Connie about it. And the third person I could recognize is Connie. And Peter's idea in tonight's event, and hopefully rise to the caliber of how both Peter and Connie envision this. I'd like to now shift and introduce our panelists here. And I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. And we'll start up with Professor Stephen Prince from the University of South Florida. And he's the author of Stories of the South, Race, and the Reconstruction of Southern Identity, 1865 to 1915, with the University of North Carolina Press. And Radical Reconstruction, A Brief History with Documents, published by Bedford St. Mark. And following him, Professor Paul Ortiz, the author of Emancipation of the Trade, It seems like that book gets cited everywhere. Every couple of weeks I see Emancipation Betrayed. So it's one of these works, I think, in Florida history, like Gerald's, that we return to time and time again. And that was published at the University of California Press. And his most recent book that, in some way, I talked to Connie about when I saw Paul give a talk about the book before it came out, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, published by Beacon Press. Paul did a talk I was witness to where he talked about Reconstruction in Key West with Cubans and Americans living in Key West and the way it fits into our notions of Reconstruction, our notions of Florida. I was really kind of floored by it. It was a wonderful talk. And following him will be Professor Barbara Gannon, whose book, The One Cause, Black and White Comradeship and the Grand Army of the Republic, published by the University of North Carolina Press, as well as Americans Remembered Their Civil War, published by Crater this past year. And following her will be Professor John Satcher, author of Perfect War of Politics, Parties, Politicians, and Democracy in Louisiana, 1824 to 1861, published by Louisiana City. And before I let the panel loose here at the podium, I want to give you all one rule to guide the panel here. And oftentimes when I'm in class, I tell students that history sometimes isn't the answer, sometimes it's the question. And so I like to give you all the freedom to pose questions you may not have the answer to if you feel so inclined to do so. I know there are some budding young historians and some old historians like myself here that might take advantage of the questions that are posed here later on. So without further ado, Mr. President.
Hi everybody, good evening. How's everybody? All right. Thanks for having me. It's delightful to be here for this great event. Thanks to Dr. Lester and to everybody else at UCF for inviting me up the road. I managed to survive I-4 today, so it was a good day. I'll just jump right in here. In the summer of 1895, the Deep South came to Brooklyn, New York. On a piece of land borrowed from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, a team of theatrical promoters built a southern plantation, complete with cabins, cotton fields, and 500 black performers. They called their production Black America. The Black America Company put on 2 stage shows a day, but the real innovation occurred offstage. With the price of admission, visitors purchased a seat at one of the performances, but also the right to walk the grounds, tour the cabins, speak to the performers, and experience plantation life in the sunny South. As the production's playbill put it, Black America allowed curious Yankees to experience, quote, the lovable bright side of Southern life in a series of animated scenes of rural simplicity in Dixie. There are any number of sites at which Northerners could witness a representation of the South, but only at Black America could they walk among the cabins, touch the cotton bolls, and interact with the performers. As the New York Times put it, quote, the cabins scattered over the grounds are exact reproductions of the old slave cabins in the South, and the work in the cotton fields that they perform is as it was when the Negroes were chattels and not free men. As it transported its audience across space, therefore, from north to south, the production also carried spectators back in time. Though the year was 1895, at Black America, it was almost like the Civil War and Reconstruction had never occurred. Most historical treatments of Reconstruction do not have much to say about Black America. But this isn't particularly surprising. First of all, chronology would seem to present a problem. The event took place in 1895, about 2 decades after the traditional end of Reconstruction in 1877. Beyond this, performance culture tends to hold little sway in the historiography of Reconstruction. What could a theatrical production, even a bizarre and spectacular one like Black America, have to tell us about Reconstruction? Well, it seems to me that Black America, which brought a southern plantation to Brooklyn in 1895, has quite a lot to teach us. Scholars of Reconstruction ignore such events at our peril. The production recreated an idealized Southern plantation. Hundreds of black actors played the role of plantation laborers whose status, free or enslaved, remained decidedly uncertain. Needless to say, questions of citizenship and voting rights had no place at Black America. All of this occurred in the deep North at the very same time as the Jim Crow system was being put in place across the South. As a cultural text and a historical event, therefore, Black America offers us a rich canvas on which to trace the nation's retreat from Reconstruction. So with Black America as sort of an introduction, I want to use my time tonight to actually argue for an expanded notion of Reconstruction, for a Reconstruction that is large enough to include the Black America production of 1895. I want to argue first that an engagement with popular culture offers valuable new approaches to the study of the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War. Popular culture both reflected and participated in the betrayal of racial egalitarianism in the United States in the decades after 1865. To limit our historical gaze to the realm of politics is to deny that Black America has anything to teach us about race relations in the post-war United States. This, I would argue, would be an unfortunate oversight. Second, I'd like to address the prevailing chronology of Reconstruction, usually understood to have stretched from 1865, sometimes 1863, to 1877. Following Jacqueline Dowd Hall and a small group of Reconstruction scholars, I want to argue for a long Reconstruction. That is, one that extends into the 1890s and perhaps even further than that. The result, I argue, is a more flexible, expansive definition of Reconstruction, better suited to capturing the complexities and controversies of the period. Since the early 20th century, political and social methodologies have dominated the historiography of Reconstruction. Given the political tumults and social trauma of the period, I think this makes intuitive sense. The first generations of scholarship on the Reconstruction period, notably the work of the Dunning School, focused almost exclusively on the electoral and legislative history of the post-war United States. Early revisionist critics like Kenneth Stamp disagreed with Dunningite conclusions, but largely maintained a focus on high politics. With the arrival of the Civil Rights era in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the new social history revolutionized the study of Reconstruction, putting the experience of emancipated African Americans front and center. To find the deepest significance of Reconstruction, social historians argued, one should not look to Congress and state capitals, but to the farms, cities, and plantations of the South. Between them, political and social historians have defined the boundaries of Reconstruction studies, influencing research agendas and shaping scholarly understandings of the period. What I want to argue tonight is that popular culture has a lot to teach us as well. Other historical subfields, the early Republic, American Empire, the Great Depression, the Cold War, have been enriched by cultural methodologies in recent decades. Historians of Reconstruction, however, have been slower to follow suit. In my book, Stories of the South, Race and the Reconstruction of Southern Identity, 1865 to 1915, I use the study of late 19th and early 20th century print, visual, and performance culture to address an important historical riddle. How did a nation that fought civil war, emancipated the slaves, and set about reconstructing the defeated South along egalitarian and democratic lines turn its back on race relations in the vanquished region in less than half a century? By all measures, Reconstruction was a moment of remarkable change in an era of radical possibility. In a few short years, in the mid-1860s, African Americans won their freedom, their citizenship, and the ballot. The South's political structures became, for the first time, truly biracial and democratic, with black office holding and black voting reaching unprecedented levels. By the first years of the 20th century, however, the tide had turned. Barely 2 decades after the removal of the last federal troops from the South in 1877, Southern white supremacists had perfected an elaborate and flexible system of physical segregation, political disfranchisement, and systematic racial violence collectively known as Jim Crow. The federal government, for the most part, did nothing. The Northern public watched with equanimity. It is this seismic shift from the egalitarian promise of Reconstruction to the nightmare of Jim Crow that my book seeks to explain. However, rather than turning to high politics, to presidential elections, and congressional debates, in search of an answer to this riddle, I turn to the realm of popular culture. Black America, the 1895 plantation spectacle that brought the plantation spectacle in Brooklyn, is one example among many. Elsewhere in the book, I study post-war travel narratives written in the first months after Appomattox, popular representations of the violence of the Ku Klux Klan and the alleged corruption of the so-called carpetbaggers, plantation fiction by Thomas Felsen Page, Joel Chandler Harris, and Charles Chestnut, tourist guides that led Northerners through the so-called New South of the 1880s, visual representations of the South published in popular Northern periodicals, the political complexities of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, the meanings of post-war stage productions of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the narrative underpinnings of writings on the so-called Negro problem of the 1890s. Such cultural texts, like Black America, are unlikely to appear in most works on Reconstruction. In Stories of the South, I argue that popular culture has a lot to tell us about race politics, the sectional relationship, and the long-term retreat from Reconstruction. A few words here on my understanding of the relationship between culture and politics. I do not argue that cultural productions in and of themselves caused the nation's turn from racial egalitarianism. Instead, I argue that the political retreat from Reconstruction could not have occurred without a contemporaneous cultural retreat from Reconstruction. An engagement with popular culture, prints, visual performance, and otherwise, allows us to recreate the imaginative landscape in which the all-too-real retreat from Reconstruction occurred. Throughout the book, I have assumed that engagement with Reconstruction in the realm of popular culture operates much like an artist's negative space. That's sort of the background painting. If you think of the Mona Lisa, all the stuff, behind the face is the negative space. I'm not an art historian, I apologize, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. So I've assumed that a popular engagement with Reconstruction in the realm of popular culture operates much like the artist's negative space, surrounding the era's more familiar political events and establishing the parameters within which the retreat from Reconstruction occurred. In order to fully understand the era's political developments, we must reconstruct the cultural and intellectual world in which they transpired. My book's most significant argument, therefore, may be its most simple. Culture matters. Stories are not ancillary affairs, mere byproducts of real history. They are the essence of human existence, and to recognize their power is to add immeasurably to our understanding of the past and to shed new light on more traditional areas of historical inquiry. Culture gives meaning to politics and shape to social realities. Stories are not outside of history, they are history. So this brings me to the second historiographical point that I want to make this evening. In 2005, historian Jacqueline Dowd Hall inaugurated a new direction in the study of the 20th century African American freedom struggle when her article, The Long Civil Rights Movement and the Political Uses of the Past, was published in the Journal of American History. Hall argued that the traditional view of a civil rights movement beginning in the post-World War II era obscured earlier generations of activism, much of it conducted by female activists and labor organizations. Now, to my knowledge, no one has theorized a comparable reperiodization for the late 19th century, but a number of historians have published works that embrace what we might call the long Reconstruction paradigm. Though this is far from a complete list, works by Stephen Hahn, Gregory Downs, Heather Cox Richardson, Edward Blum, David Blight, Caroline Janney, Paul Ortiz, as well as several faculty members at UCF, as a matter of fact, each adopt a chronology that extends from the close of the Civil War into the early decades of the 20th century. Stories of the South fits nicely into this long Reconstruction literature, carrying its story of race politics and popular culture from 1865 to the release of the film Birth of a Nation in 1915. So what's at stake in this frame? Well, I think the long Reconstruction perspective usefully decenters 1877, the traditional end of Reconstruction, asking us to focus on longer-term continuities across the latter part of the 19th century. The much-vaunted removal of federal troops from the former Confederacy in 1877 was absolutely a significant moment, but it did little to solve the larger questions that had animated the Reconstruction enterprise. The free people's transition to freedom, the enumeration and protection of civil and political rights, the obligations and powers of a newly expanded federal government, the proper relationship between the sections in the aftermath of a horrific civil war, none of these questions were solved in 1877. The traditional textbook rendering of the late 19th century, in which Reconstruction stops abruptly in 1877, reduces the egalitarianism of the immediate post-war period to a sort of passing fancy, a 12-year aberration. Beyond this, I find it gives the North a pass on the more unsavory aspects of late 19th century race politics. Jim Crow was born in the South, but the nation watched at every step of the way. The nation's engagement with the Southern question did not cease in 1877, it simply took a new form. To embrace a longer Reconstruction is to place the struggles of the Reconstruction period where they would belong, at the very heart of our narratives of the post-Civil War United States. As Black America reminds us, struggles over Reconstruction occurred in a more diverse array of sites and for a much longer period of time than traditional histories of Reconstruction would suggest. Reconstruction was a political project, but it was simultaneously a cultural and intellectual one. Expanding our source base and broadening our chronological focus allows us to see the broader contours of the period and to recognize the interplay between politics and popular culture. In the process, we bring ourselves closer to the cultural and intellectual world in which Reconstruction was made and unmade. Now, if you'll indulge me for a moment at the conclusion of my remarks here, I'd like to close with a nod to contemporary affairs, very contemporary affairs, one that will, in a roundabout way, bring us back to Shofner, in whose honor we are here tonight. As I assume you're all aware, there's an election coming up on November 6th. How many of you are familiar with Amendment 4, the Florida ballot this year? Good, I'm glad I'm taking the time to talk about this right now. Amendment 4, which will go to the voters on November 6th, will amend the Florida State Constitution to make it possible for some 1.4 million Floridians to regain the ability to vote. As currently written, the state's constitution makes it all but impossible for people convicted of a felony to regain the right to vote. In most U.S. states, the completion of all parts of a sentence, that is prison, probation, parole, any fines, after doing that, the person is immediately eligible to regain the right to vote. In Florida, however, even after completing all portions of a sentence, a returning citizen is required to wait an additional 5 to 7 years before adding one's name to a wait list in the hopes of securing a personal hearing with the governor's clemency board. That waiting list stretches to hundreds of thousands of names. The process can take any number of years, even decades. In 2011, Rick Scott's first full year in office, the clemency board restored voting rights to a grand total of 52 applicants. So what does this have to do with Reconstruction? Well, the portions of the state constitution under consideration were written in 1868. In the months after the Confederate surrender in April of 1865, every former Confederate state, including Florida, passed black codes designed to limit the rights and freedom of the formerly enslaved. Among other things, Florida's black codes created several new categories of crime designed to be applied largely to African Americans. Responding to these events, the federal government was forced to take steps to protect the civil rights of Southern African Americans, culminating in the Reconstruction Act of 1867. This act required each former Confederate state to hold a constitutional convention to draft a new constitution guaranteeing African American men the right to vote. Until they did, the states of the former Confederacy could not regain their seats in Congress. So what did Florida's white elites do? Well, they could not abide the idea of black men voting, but they were not allowed to deny the right to vote on the basis of race. So the Constitution they produced in 1868 granted the suffrage to, quote, every male person of the age of 21 years and upwards of whatever race, color, nationality, or previous condition, thereby meeting the guidelines laid out by the federal government. At the same time, however, this 1868 Constitution added a number of provisions that undercut this universalist language about about voting. The Constitution weakened political representation from areas with large black populations. It added an educational requirement for voters, which was waived for people who had voted in previous state elections, all of whom, of course, would have been white. And most important for our purposes, it imposed a lifetime ban for people with felony convictions when combined with the new categories of felonies that applied disproportionately to the formerly enslaved African Americans of Florida. This felon disfranchisement provision applied disproportionately to African Americans, which was, of course, precisely the point. Jarrell Shofner, whose honor we are gathered here tonight, said this, quote, "Felony disfranchisement was a way of reducing the effect of the despised black suffrage that Florida conservatives knew they had no alternative but to accept." The language about felon disfranchisement, put into the state constitution in 1868 to make it more difficult for African Americans to exercise the right to vote, is the language that remains in the state constitution to this day. It is this language that Amendment 4 seeks to change. So I will leave you with this. The legacies of Reconstruction run deep. You may not have realized it, but we're still grappling with the legacies of this state's long Reconstruction. I'm not going to tell you how to vote. I will tell you to vote on November 6th. I'm not going to tell you how to vote. But I will ask you to seriously consider the roots of felon disfranchisement in Florida when you consider Amendment 4 on November 6th. When you go to the polls, you'll be taking part in a 150-year-old conversation about race, rights, access, and power. Reconstruction lives on. Thank you very much.
Good evening. How's everyone doing? What an amazing presentation. Let's give Professor this another. I'm not going to dissent from a single word you said, except to say that I thought you were an arts majors and undergraduate. So great about culture. It's fabulous. I want to start by just thanking you all for bringing me here. Colleagues in the history profession know that when Professor Connie Lester asks you to do something, wise to do it. And so when Dr. Lester called me, I said right away, yes. And I just want to commend the work that you've been doing here. Thank you to the co-sponsoring agencies, organizations for Historical Quarterly. I'm excited to see a very vibrant chapter by Theta, creating history troublemakers well into the future, right? Thank you. And also to mention how humbling it is to be asked to take part in this with Professor Prince and some of my colleagues. And to think about what Jarrell Shofner meant to us. I know Stephen touched on this, Connie Robert in their introductions too. You have to picture me as a graduate student, I almost said young graduate student. I wasn't really that young in grad school, but I was younger than I am now. That is true. But I would carry around with me a copy of Professor Shofner's work in Reconstruction. And I carried it everywhere I went. In fact, I'm sure I had to pay a lot of library fines because I would forget to re-up the book, and that book on Reconstruction, when I think of Professor Shofner, Joe Richardson's work in Reconstruction, along with W.E.B. Du Bois's Great Black Reconstruction, I think of those three books, Professor Lester, kind of as a sacred kind of trio for many of us in graduate school that allowed us to break out of that Dunning mode of history. Even though the Dunning School had long since been surpassed by the time I was in graduate school in the 90s, a lot of the assumptions are still with us. And as Professor Prince pointed out, felony disenfranchisement is still with us. This false notion of corruption in Reconstruction governments is still with us. And worst of all, this false notion of African American history and the incredible contributions of African Americans during Reconstruction and beyond continues to be covered up somehow. And these are things that I think the lecture is designed to really challenge, and I'm just honored to be a part of it. As Robert mentioned, I just finished a book called An African American and Latinx History of the United States. And in the middle chapter of the book, is actually on Reconstruction. It's called Global Visions of Reconstruction. I show here the outline, the chapter outline of the book. Reconstruction really is the bridge in many ways. It's kind of the halfway point of the book. And I'm using it to argue a few things about U.S. history. One is that we can complain about white nationalism, this resurgence of nationalism that we're experiencing, this kind of lack of curiosity that Americans seem to have about other countries, the monolingualism, the monoculturalism. We can complain about all of those kind of insular tendencies of this culture, but if we teach a U.S. history that continues to be insular and monolingual or monocultural, we've done it to ourselves. It's kind of a self-destructive policy. So the idea behind this book is to point out that from the very outset, even before the American Revolution, Central America, Africa, Latin America have just as much and even more impact on U.S. culture, politics, certainly ideas of liberation and freedom than Europe does. And if you think of that long time period in the 18th and 19th centuries, think about where the freedom movements are being born, the anti-colonial movements, but also think about what parts of the world are generating eugenics, fascism, Nazism, okay, social Darwinism. And you think of these competing ideas and interests. So let me talk a little bit about Reconstruction in the new book and how I kind of built on the first book, Emancipation and Trade. I have to say that it was a humbling experience to take another look at Reconstruction. Because even after reading Professor Shofner, W.E. Du Bois, George Richardson, these amazing works, I still, in Emancipation and Trade, have a very kind of national view of Reconstruction. Now I've learned, after rereading these books, and I think Connie, we're talking rereading Black Reconstruction yet again recently, I begin to understand that Reconstruction is not a national event, or it is a national event, but it's also from the beginning an international event as well. It's an event that takes place in the midst of a lot of things. You know, one of them is empire. One of them is colonialism and anti-colonialism, right? The U.S. is a former colonized society, which during Reconstruction has already been acting as an imperial society. We'll get to that in a moment. William Alton Williams is a very important historian for my work because he talked about empire as a way of life. And I argue in my chapter, Global Visions of Reconstruction, African Americans key on this topic of empire to argue for an anti-imperial kind of politics that they're trying to build. But where did they get this from? So I talk about a thing I call emancipatory internationalism. And here I'm again kind of ripping off Du Bois, but also Cedric Robinson, his work in the Black radical tradition, to argue that African American political cultures throughout the entire Americas, in North America, in fact, I was just in the Eastern Shore, Maryland, talk about an amazing place for the Black radical tradition. Harry Tubman, Henry Highland Barnett, Frederick Douglass, the birth of the Underground Railroad, the people in the Port of Baltimore, the first communities to really understand the importance of the Haitian Revolution, right? It all happens in many ways in the Eastern Shore. But what I call emancipatory internationalism is this idea that freedom, that I can have freedom for myself, but unless I'm concerned, unless I care about the freedom of you, people outside of this room, even people outside of our nation, then I am really selling myself short, and I'm not understanding the fact that my freedom is definitely is intimately tied to the freedom or lack of freedom of people, and not only around me, but in other countries as well. We will recognize this very much in Martin Luther King's work in writing in the 1960s, in working with people like Malcolm X. But my argument is that this is something, what I call emancipatory internationalism, this idea that African Americans are always looking internationally, okay? That's very important and in many ways comes to a kind of culmination during Reconstruction. Imperialism is at the center of U.S. history. It becomes a central topic during Black Reconstruction. Frederick, I'm not going to read these quotes for you, but Frederick Douglass, in the middle of the American Civil War, is trying to explain to Americans why the Civil War happened. And he recenters the struggle against slavery and the origins of the Civil War as a story of imperialism and anti-imperialism. He says, you brought it on yourselves. You had to invade Florida. You had to invade Mexico. You had to invade Central America. You had to invade all these nations. In fact, many of them, like Mexico, had abolished slavery long before the U.S. did. But the U.S. invades Mexico to do what? To reimpose slavery. The U.S. invades Central America to do what? To reimpose slavery. The U.S. even talks about purchasing Cuba in the 1850s to do what? To benefit from slavery. And Douglass says, this is why I'm not going to say that the North is better than the South. In fact, if you look at the Wall Street banks, if you look at the Northern money establishment, it has just as much or much more actually in many ways to do with the pushing of slavery outside of the boundaries of the U.S. Slavery is an imperial system from the very beginning. So in the middle of Reconstruction, this incredible movement flourishes. And I'll just read the first sentence of my chapter on Reconstruction, Global Visions of Reconstruction. African Americans decided that emancipation in one country was not enough. So all throughout the United States, in states like Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, but as far west as California, Washington State, everywhere you have black communities, black political organizations, they agitated for the abolition of slavery in Cuba, oftentimes for the abolition of slavery in Brazil, oftentimes for the abolition of serfdom in Russia, and tried to emphasize and connect the concerns that they were having locally with these international struggles. What I mean by this is that if you look at black, or what we call back then, what they call colored conventions during Reconstruction in southern Louisiana, voting is often issue number one, right? And let's make sure slavery is really ended. Issues number two, Klan violence, things like that. And then the Cuban liberation struggle in the 10 Years' War is up there. And why I said this was humbling research for me is I read the same exact convention documents, 10, 15 years later after I finished my first book, and then realized I missed this whole other dimension of black internationalism. The idea that African Americans in the Deep South and all across the country were vitally concerned with the freedom and liberation struggles of people in Cuba. One of the amazing things that happens, and this is the leadership of the Cuban anti-slavery movement, is that when African Americans, and Professor Prince touched on this, gain more rights, and I want us to think about freedom dialectically for a moment. So it's possible to think about the expansion of democracy, also is possible, an important thing about the contraction of democracy. Think of Reconstruction, or a long Reconstruction movement, more people gaining rights, privileges, the ability to pursue their individual pursuits or individual, whatever they want to do, versus the time in which people are prevented from being full human beings. Okay, so Reconstruction is a positive thing in the sense that it's an expansive vision of democracy and liberation based on black popular movements. What happens in the middle of Reconstruction, a lot of people forgot, is that Hispanic people gain tremendously. When black people gain the right to vote, when they fight to win the right to vote, they are also able to pass a thing called alien declarant voting. And Robert mentioned the Key West example. I didn't realize this when I was writing Emancipation of Trade, but the alien declarant voting meant that a person who just arrived from Cuba or any nation overseas sets foot in Key West or Jacksonville, all you have to do is go to a registrar and say, I promise to become a naturalized citizen, and you get to vote. And this allows a tremendous interracial political coalition to evolve, not only in Florida, but in other parts of the country. That's the expansion of liberation, the expansion of democracy. Redemption, or the counter-assault against Reconstruction, involves the elimination of alien declarant voting. And it not only happens in Florida, but it happens in New York, it happens in Boston, because northern political machines are trying to discipline and really subtract the rights of these immigrants. These are, I mentioned, the leaders of the Cuban anti-slavery movement. This was a movement very strong in Florida. Many of you who do Florida history will recognize Josiah T. Walls. But again, I want to emphasize to you that all throughout the country, these meetings are occurring. This is just kind of a wonderful visual example of how the national Cuban anti-slavery movement, led by black political leaders, conducted in churches, labor unions, lodges, becomes national and it gets to the floor of the U.S. Congress. Other things that happened during Reconstruction, which were really cool in terms of liberty, one of these happens, I think this fits with Professor Prince's expanded notion of Reconstruction in terms of chronology. In 1884, there's an emergency meeting of African Americans which takes place in Gainesville, Florida. Now, you all don't think anything happens in Gainesville, right? But a lot of things happen in Gainesville. We're not as big as Orlando, but things happen there. The expansion of democracy in that moment is so incredible because if you look at that convention, and I found the minutes of that convention, by the way, in the papers of Frederick Douglass. This is what the convention meant to Douglass, enough that he wanted to gather these papers. And in the middle of this is a plan that's launched and by James Dean, not the great actor, but an African American who becomes an elected judge. And in it, I'm not going to read this to you, but in it he presents a plan of slavery compensation, slavery reparations, that just takes the last 30 years of slavery and says, let's start with 1830. We could go back further, but if you all paid us the wages you should have paid us from 1830, the end of the Civil War, we can use that money to rebuild Florida's pathetic system of public education. And we're going to use this money to rebuild the whole educational system. Now, think about how expansive of a democracy idea that is. The Cuban solidarity movement is everywhere. Many of you political historians will recognize J. Wilson Pinar, the first African American elected to Congress, not allowed to take a seat, of course. He's in Key West. The Key West moment, if you will, brings a lot of incredibly talented and many bilingual African American political organizers to Key West. The solidarity movement culminates in the middle of Reconstruction with a short-term failure. And the failure I attribute to racial capitalism. There's too much money invested in Cuban slavery for the United States to throw down with the people fighting against slavery in Cuba. Slavery is much too lucrative. This is also why we had the bloody Civil War in this country. Slavery was not dying off. It was not going to die slow death. It was the most incredibly profitable system of economics known up to that point. So in conclusion, I want to bring us back to W.E.B. Du Bois so that we kind of remember where, some fundamentals here. And again, I'm not going to read this passage for you, except to say that Du Bois is trying to talk about why Reconstruction is important. And when Du Bois says that Reconstruction was the finest effort to achieve democracy for the working millions which this world had ever seen, that's what he means. Reconstruction is not, again, just a national event. It is the finest effort to achieve democracy for the working millions which this world had ever seen. But the short-term defeat of Reconstruction has a terrible impact, which, again, just echoing Professor Prince, still plagues us to this day. The notion of felony disenfranchisement voting, how on earth are we still working with that as a major part of the system? I mean, I'll just go ahead and tell you, my canvas on behalf of Amendment 4, I'm happy to say, please vote for it. Because if you want to continue living and supporting the black codes of Reconstruction, that's your choice. But we have a couple choices we can make in this society. One is which we expand democracy, we expand freedom, or the other road is we move towards apartheid. We move towards fascism. Those of you who are historians of Nazism will understand, will know the recent literature tells us very clearly, where do the 1935 Nuremberg racial laws in Nazi Germany come from? A very powerful tendency, root is in this country. The Nazis loved the U.S. South. They studied the Jim Crow laws and here they knew them better than anyone else, and they used part of those laws to build Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg racial laws. That's the Key West symbol, as Robert knows, of the Knights of Labor, organization I love to talk about. And just again, in conclusion, to think about African American political aspirations as always involving Mexico, Central America, South America, not in building walls, but in creating connections between freedom movements of the different hemispheres, to see the hemisphere whole, if you will, to build bridges instead of walls. So thank you for being very patient.
Well, my role is commenting. And John and I were talking, and it looks like we sort of divided our roles very well without talking to each other. First, thank you for allowing me to be here and to comment on these fine papers. Now, each of these represents the many ways scholars are broadening the scope of Reconstruction as a study. I can say without hesitation that these represent the cutting edge of Reconstruction scholarship. But first, we need to figure out how we got here. Now, as part of my comprehensive exams, I've read a whole lot of books on Reconstruction, and I mean many, 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 many. In my final essay, which I wrote half asleep, I'd been up for about 48 hours, I argued that there was an easy way to tell me exactly how a book felt about Reconstruction. If the word Negro was capitalized, Reconstruction was, if it wasn't capitalized, it was small n Negro. It was terrible. It was the worst thing that ever happened anyway. If it was capitalized, it was wonderful, it was an experiment, it should have succeeded, blah, blah, blah. And it was all about how the author viewed Reconstruction, how the broader society viewed it, what the style manual said about whether you capitalize Negro or not. Everything always goes back to African Americans in Reconstruction, even though for a long time, people sort of made white people more of the stars. It's all about the race, the status of race, and social, political, civil status of African Americans. Mostly, sadly, this is a small end story. Now, in the not very distant past, scholars treated Reconstruction as primarily a political effort, absolutely. It was a way of reconstructing the Union after the war. There was this kind of weird thing that Lincoln said they hadn't really left the Union, but they really had. So they had to be brought back in. And they had to agree to the amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, to various degrees. There were small number, and I mean small number of U.S. troops that were stationed in order to keep peace. We know there's a great deal of violence with the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, and later without the Ku Klux Klan. No one needed them. No one needed any white hoods to go around and kill and butcher people. For a very long time, though, this was a story in American history, and I can show you textbooks. The end of Reconstruction, it was a victory for white Southerners, and everything decent and right dominated the popular scholars' view. It was the greatest moment in American history because no longer do you have the illiterate, the corrupt. We really have created a United States. And you want to say, of white people? The villains of the peace were white carpetbaggers and ignorant African Americans. Newly free wasn't their fault. They were being exploited by white Republicans. Only when the South was redeemed, and yes, that is the word they used, was democracy triumphant. There was an entire school at Columbia University, the Dunning School, and I think he's been mentioned. I mean, he has his students, Dunning and his students, he was sort of the professor. They churned out enough books, you would think they were writing Japanese anime, how good they could do it. On every state, and they had the same message, hurrah, hurrah, white people have won. So, corrupt carpetbagger, ignorant African Americans, victimized whites, eventual triumph when white rule was restored. Now, the popular statement of this was a book called The Tragic Era by Claude Bowers in the 1920s. It gives you some idea how long this lasted. It lasted well after it was in the textbooks for a very long time. The Southern people literally were put to torture. Even historians have shrunk from the unhappy task of showing the torture chambers. Like many of this era, this is one thing you have to do, only white people are Southerners. like it or not. Now, the first break came with someone we've heard about, W. Boys. And he believed, of course, that it was a short-lived triumph of democracy whose tragedy was that it ended. Now, he wrote in the 1930s, but no one listened, mostly because he was an African American. Though it's an amazing feat that this book was published by a mainstream publisher, his book, Black Reconstruction, which you should read. And he was considered on the radical end of politics. His language was Marxist historical analysis. And really, it wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement, when many things changed, that people started listening to what he had said. For a very long time, until well after I was in the Civil Rights Movement, the white tragedy story prevailed. Now, ironically, really, it was a BA from Columbia and a Columbia professor, Shofner, who popularized and took a lot of these ideas. He called Reconstruction an unfinished revolution, and that African Americans were central to it, and that it, again, was only bad because of hate. Of course, there were so many others who had written about Reconstruction, but he made the grand statement. Now, more recently, people have included Reconstruction. For a long time, it did not include women. To reconstructing labor relations, social institutions, the family, gender and gender relations. It's not just political anymore, and you're seeing that. Now, both of these marvelous presentations reflect the next step. Professor Ortiz reflects the best in the new scholarship that globalizes Reconstruction. Previously, it had been seen as an exceptional American experience, just like everything in America is exceptional. The boundaries of Reconstruction were the southern states that were officially politically reconstructed. Tennessee cleverly avoided that by sneaking back into the Union. More recently, the notion of Reconstruction in the West, no one ever thought of that, has expanded the boundaries of Reconstruction, and even to the North, which never left the Union. Now the notion that Reconstruction was an international phenomenon and it was part of a larger movement, it was not so much political, but about global emancipation and the end of slavery around the world. Now, Dr. Ortiz places Reconstruction squarely in this broader phenomenon. He talks about African American Reconstruction in the United States, but also how they do Reconstruction. And you have to understand this, for a long time, you could read the whole Reconstruction book and have no African Americans say anything or be listened to. And that's one way you make it a white tragedy. You have no black voices. He documents their support of Cuban emancipation, which did not occur until 20 years after the Civil War's end. Much of the support had to do with their understanding, particularly, and it's not a completely elite phenomenon, but you have to say it's of the cities and people who know what's going on in the world, that they had to, African Americans had to stand by their brethren. Now, this makes a great deal of sense that it was an urban elite phenomenon, because people barely surviving on the margins may be more concerned with their locality. But based on my work in this area, I believe this is a great understudied area. And understudied because people don't understand that African Americans had a very strong sense of foreign policy as it affected race. I saw that reading on World War I. I was fascinated by his discussion of Key West because I found an integrated GAR post, the Union Army's largest veterans organization, there. And I thought that was weird, but I didn't know anything about Key West, so I just went on. And that is always a sign of a racial comity in the community. He also represents borderlands. That's very much a borderlands, what the borderlands of the United States, with a mix of people and how that shapes things. Now the key here, though, is the idea of racial capitalism. Reconstruction was about a broader movement, a broader struggle against it and imperialism, and that's very important and cutting edge. Now, Dr. Prince expands its temporal limits, and oh boy, that's a big fight right now in Civil War and Reconstruction. He describes this aspect of popular culture and production, sort of like, I guess it was colonial Williamsburg for slaves. That's all I could think as I read his paper. And it's really talks, a lot of people are pushing it past 1877. And they push it off into where he does, Plessy versus Ferguson and segregation. And this is a very huge issue. Now, the key here, I think, is one of the importance of popular culture. And I've been in this wrestle myself. Popular culture is popular. So it must represent something that keys off on things people are concerned with or interested. When I thought of New York, I thought of Nina Silver's work, when their anxieties weren't about race, but about immigration and nation and a modernizing industrial economy. This was an idyllic rural environment. So I thought of that. So when you think of popular culture, you have to think, does it shape how people view? Does it reflect? What does it do exactly? One thing it firmly does, and I think you see that by his time period, it has a power over the future. People who do not know anything about slavery, that is their slavery. It is the slavery of birth of a nation. It is the Reconstruction of birth of a nation. It is the slavery of Gone with the Wind, which you may be more familiar with. So people who don't know anything or don't read books, popular culture has a power well after the event, and I think we need to consider that very closely. Now, my favorite part was the stories, because stories are not ancillary affairs, mere byproducts of real history. They are the essence of human existence. Stories are not outside of history, they are history. Now, scholars sometimes believe that if we tell people the facts enough, they will listen to us, and they will discontinue their belief in false narratives. I don't know if that's true. I think maybe you have to change the narrative. But I always think my most influential sort of theorist was Benedict Anderson's idea of an imagined community, which I think America and national identity is an imagined community that accepts some and throws others out, depending on our mood at that stage in history. We have to remember it's an imagined community, and this imagined community can be committed to equality or inequality, and it has been either way in the past. So I think what you heard here is very important, because this is how people want to look at a new Reconstruction that is both international in scope and broader in time. Thank you.
I don't know if I've ever been to an academic event where they have 4 speakers and they all finished on time, so I'm actually going to keep that rolling here, keep the trend going here. I'm going to direct most of my comments tonight to the students in the audience, but I hope they're useful to everyone who's here. First, we've designed the Shofner lecture tonight in the format more or less of an academic conference. Scholars present their papers, and commentators offer their insights. Often this involves a scholar or commentator, such as myself, showing off their own work and or criticizing the speakers for not writing the precise paper that I wanted them to write, as if more responded that they didn't do enough, as if 20 minutes is able to master any topic here. As you've already seen, Dr. Gannon did not do that. I don't plan to take that approach either, for various reasons, including the fact that these scholars know much more about Reconstruction or Florida Reconstruction than I do, and because both delivered excellent papers. So you might wonder why I'm here, but much like Dr. Ortiz, when Dr. Lester asks you to do something, you do it. So I'm here to offer my insights here. And I think what insight to offer here is to use Reconstruction or Florida Reconstruction as a jumping off point for the way we should think about history and your history classes in general. The presentations of Dr. Ortiz and Dr. Prince and Shofner's own work remind us that you should think about history in longer and broader terms. Longer. As history students, you should think beyond traditional periodization. Dr. Prince alluded to both the long civil rights movement and the long Reconstruction, and these are useful ideas. At most universities and in most textbooks, Reconstruction is a nice, neat time period. It starts in either 1863, with the Union's effort to construct a government in Louisiana, or even prior to the end of the Civil War, or in 1865, with the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment and ending slavery. Reconstruction is almost always depicted as ending in 1877, with federal troops left in the South. It's a story that has a beginning, some interesting plot twists, such as when radical and congressional Reconstruction replaces presidential Reconstruction, has violent episodes, the Klan in the South, the White League, race riots in the nation, and a dramatic conclusion, the contested presidential election, followed by a secret political agreement preserving national unity at the expense of African Americans. Within this narrative, historians have found no shortage of villains and heroes. Those Dr. Gannon has pointed out, those villains and heroes have changed over time. The heroes of the 1930s are now the villains, and vice versa. While Reconstruction offers a neat, compelling, concise story, it doesn't take deep thinking to realize the story is incomplete. If one of the central questions of Reconstruction was, what was to be the status of the former slaves, or more broadly, all African Americans in the South, or even more broadly, all African Americans in the United States, I don't think that it involves a heavily footnoted book or a panel of scholars to make you realize that the status of race relations in the United States wasn't resolved completely in 1877. Some term the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s as a second Reconstruction. And one can make the argument that the question of race still dominates much of society's discourse today. So maybe 1877 isn't a great ending date for Reconstruction, but there's not a problem unique to Reconstruction. My guess is just about every history class you take could start at an earlier date or end at a later date. When I start my Civil War Reconstruction class, I point out to the class, well, Civil War starts in 1861, so we're going to, of course, start back in 1848, and then I proceed to start even before then, because you can never start too early if you're a historian. Almost every history class goes back, the Big Bang, primordial fluid, something like that. We always have to start. There's always something before that explains what happened then. And the same thing at the end. We always end, and we can never wrap everything up in a tight little bow. Everything goes beyond that. In regards to this periodization, just last week, I had a student in that Civil War course come to my office and tell me that he had come to the discovery that the part of the class he understood the best was the start in 1848, because he had taken a Jacksonian American class over the summer. He said that ended right when your class begins. Almost as if we planned it that way in the history of the book. Perhaps we had. This is exactly what you should be thinking about all the time. How does this class that I'm taking now connect to the ones I've taken before? How does it connect both across time and across breadth? And that's what I want to talk about next. Not only should we think longer, we should think broader. In this case, Dr. Ortiz makes the argument connecting the events of Reconstruction to the events of the Caribbean. All of your classes have a geographic focus, but these countries, regions, etc., don't exist in a vacuum. They're not in isolation from one another. While the Civil War and Reconstruction are occurring, the French are intervening in Mexico, the Franco-Prussian War takes place, and British troops are entering Afghanistan. Also, Reconstruction is perceived as a time when the nation is focused on the South. And certainly the South and the South's problems are very important to Reconstruction. But we need to be aware of not just isolation in terms of nations, but isolation in terms of regions. The South is indisputably tied to Reconstruction, but there are plenty of other things going on in the country very important during the 1860s and 1870s. In promontory Point in Utah, the Golden Spike was driven completing the Trans-Continental Railroad. Conflict with Native Americans on the western frontier affected many Americans, with one of these dramatic events being Custer's last stand in 1876. Susan B. Anthony was writing the words that would become the 19th Amendment for women's suffrage, although of course that wasn't passed until later. Inventions including the light bulb, the phonograph, and the telephone provided a sense of national optimism, while labor strike connected to the Molly Wires, the Panic of 1873, and the railroad strike of 1877 showed that all did not benefit equally in the technological and business changes occurring. We need to be aware that events in a particular region and nation don't exist in a vacuum in both history and today's world as well. In the 21st century, the question of immigration is not simply a United States issue. Economic nationalism appears across the globe, and the status of minorities and women is certainly a question with broad ramifications. And to go back to the Amendment 4 that they alluded to with Dr. Shofner, well, over a decade ago, Dr. Shofner appeared as an expert legal witness in trying to overturn Amendment 4, or trying to overturn these voting rights, founding voting rights judicially. It's only because that event failed that we've come to the point where this has to be a constitutional amendment. In sum, the ideas brought up by Dr. Ortiz, Dr. Prince, and Dr. Shofner are relevant to all times and places, and history students should look beyond the silo of a particular time or course to see broader questions. So as students, I encourage you to think beyond a lecture, beyond your grade on paper, beyond any extra credit you might be receiving to come here tonight, possible, beyond the midterm and beyond the final. Instead, to realize the value of your history classes, I urge you to seek connection across space and time and to relate the events in the classes you are taking this semester to the events you've taken in classes before, and to the world today. Raise your hand and ask your professors about these connections. But if you do it a lot, don't mention that I suggested the idea, because it might frustrate you after a while. And be prepared if you ask me questions in my class. If you ask me, for example, I don't know, ask me to compare slaves with slave conditions of emancipation to Russian serfdom. I'll say, go ask Dr. Silver. No, I will say, maybe you should go look that up yourself. And that's not a threat or a time or an effort to get you to stop asking questions. It is a plea to think about those questions and go research those questions inside and outside your class. Of course, you all are here on a Monday evening at the Shofner lecture, so you're already thinking about history outside your classes. You're well underway to meeting the challenge of length and breadth that Drs. Prince and Ortiz have articulated this evening. Please continue to pursue that challenge. Thank you.
We can give another hand to our counselor for finishing on time. Do you have a second microphone? Tiffany here? All right. I'm going to let you all figure out who gets the microphone question. Just pass it around. And it's a Q&A part where you get to stump the panelists, right? No, joke.
Yes, my question is about Reconstruction and violence, so I'm going to direct it to Dr. Ortiz. In your book, Emancipation Betrayed, you mentioned that you used the words of Dr. Oliver Cox, he's a sociologist, and he says that lynching and disenfranchisement are inseparably linked. And then Du Bois' book, Black Reconstruction, he talks about the foundations of rich violence and other forms of sadism being interracial sex jealousy. And I was just curious to see how these two motivations for violence may intersect.
Yeah, it's a great question, mentioning Oliver Cromwell Cox, who wrote an amazing book published shortly after World War II called Caste, Class, and Race, in which he was trying to, I think of Cox in tandem with W.E.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James in terms of how they, all three of them, saw slavery as a global system. They saw slavery as really an imperial system. And I think your question is, what are some of the roots of racial violence? Thinking of Cox, is it about labor? Is it about sex? And I think in Emancipation Betrayed, I try to think of racism as, I didn't try to think of it. Basically, after years and years and years of research and microfilm, which led me to become wearing glasses, by the way, I realized, racism is really about exploitation, number one. And racial capitalism, this is a term which we learned from people like Oliver Cox or Cedric Robinson, is again a global system. It's designed, because slavery doesn't just exist in the United States. Racism doesn't just exist in the United States. And people within the African diaspora see a world systems theory of understanding capitalism just in the ways in which I talk about time. Essentially what I'm learning from is Cox's analysis of slavery and racism as a global system. There's a much larger argument that Cox makes in Caste, Class, and Race, which, by the way, is a 600-page book, like Black Reconstruction, Dr. Lister, so it's not an overnight coffee table read. But essentially what Cox does, which has never really been challenged, people try to challenge it, it's never been overturned, is to say that racism arises out of European capitalism. And he traces the kind of the final years of feudalism, but he refuses to say that feudalism ended because it does not end. There are still very strong echoes of feudalism in this society today. Landlord, for example, or labor relations, so on and so forth. So I very much continue to believe that racism is very much tied to the economic system, to labor exploitation.
I guess actually I could just take up the part of your question where you asked about the idea of interracial sex as a cause for racial violence. And I think we'd be better suited to think of it as an excuse for racial violence. That is, this is one of those stories that I was talking about. That, I mean, you can track it in the literature. You can see when the story is born. You know, nobody's talking about black men raping white women all that much before the 1890s, and then all of a sudden it's all anybody can talk about. And I mean, you know, one of my first clues here was actually Frederick Douglass's, I think it's his last major speech. He delivers in 1895, and he says, "Words are things." I just love that frame. Words are things, and they have power, and they have meaning, and we need to pay attention to the words that are used. And then Douglass, sort of speaking to you know, white Southerners generally, he says, "You never used to make this excuse about speech on lynching." He says, "You never used to make this excuse about black men raping white women." During the Civil War, the story was all about how you know, the faithful male slaves were left at home and they helped white women. And during Reconstruction, the excuse for violence was that we were equals all of a sudden, and that was a problem for you. And now all of a sudden, we become barbaric beasts who are fiendish with lust for white women. And Douglass says, look at your stories. They don't, you know, they don't track. You've almost through time. I.B. Wells makes a similar set of arguments about precisely the same thing, and I think it's you know, they're correct. Douglass is seeing it in real time. If you go back as a historian, you see the birth of the story. The real motives are you know, political, economic, but this sort of, you know, idea of sexual violence as the cause of all racial violence is a, you know, I would consider it a sort of cultural construct. It's a discourse that is created in a particular historical moment for a particular set of historical ends. It proves extraordinarily effective for an awful long time.
But everyone at once. I can't see all of them.
Why don't we ask the senators to respond to the comments?
I was going to ask some questions. If you're up for it. Okay. So one of the things I think about, because I myself am trying to expand the definition of Reconstruction, its application, and something I've been kind of thinking about recently, just as an exercise or a thought experiment, and we can employ the $10,000 pyramid rule. You could pass if you want to pass this question, because I'm going to be blindsided something, I think. But I wonder, and I know some people do, but for Florida, I wonder, is there an environmental history of Reconstruction? So, raise your hand and pass it.
Yes, there is, and I can't wait to read it.
Well, I'm just going to make something up. Because you're not asking me to do any research, you're just asking, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, and again, to echo what Stephen said earlier, you know, kind of the past is in the present and the future, right? Just as it's not surprising that before would come up in the discussion of the 1868 Constitution, green algae should come up if we're talking expansively about the land movements before these consecutive efforts to parcel off land, we haven't talked yet about indigenous histories as well, Native American, the expropriation of Native Americans in Florida and other parts of the country, and the fate not only of Native Americans, but the fate of what happens to the earth, the planet, wherever indigenous people have been. When they're pushed out of those areas, what happens then next, the subsequent history is environmental catastrophe. And so what we're seeing now in the state of Florida, all up and down, is in some ways a reckoning again back to, I'm not sure if it's just in Reconstruction, but obviously the idea of the carpetbagger as a person who comes in to take advantage of these huge, vast areas of land. So for Florida, for example, when I was researching emancipation trade, African Americans saw Florida for a moment as a great place of great promise, because it had a very, very small white population, a lot of Native Americans, a lot of open land. But what is open land? Open land is a concept, getting back to Dr. Canada, it's almost like part of that imagined community of environmentalism. There is no such thing as open land. People were on that land for
exploitation. After it was ratified, after that passed, slavery can't really be a thing anymore. And the African community needs to be incorporated into society. But what good would it have done all of the white population for racism to actually be a thing? It doesn't seem to help the economy in any sort of way. It doesn't seem to help anybody in any sort of way. If slavery was just about exploitation, how can racism come out of that? Because it doesn't seem to be any sort of actual bias.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think part of it has to do with, what replaces slavery, and that's very much an open question in 1865, certainly for a long period after that. African Americans, for their part, expressed a desire to work their own lands, basically, ideally to own their own lands, but to be independent, sort of self-responsible landowners. White landowners across the South weren't so into that idea. Somebody had to pick all that cotton, right? Somebody had to do the work in the fields on these large plantations. Sharecropping, I'm relying on Eric Foner's vision of it really here for the most part, but sharecropping is effectively a compromise between, at least in its early years, between African Americans who don't want to do wage labor for somebody else, who want to be in charge of their own livelihood and their own pace of work and their own sort of space of work, and white landowners who need somebody to do the labor. Sharecropping then quickly becomes its own form of exploitation. You sign labor contracts, you provide loans that can't be repaid, you keep people on the land over the course of years, even generations, by sort of accruing levels of debt. There are. Slavery is not the only way to exploit a population economically, and white Southerners prove remarkably adept at sort of, pivoting and turning to a different system. Economically, in terms of politics, I think the very idea of black men voting was inconceivable for most white Southerners in the 1860s. Absolutely inconceivable. And there are very real social and economic reasons to stack the deck in terms of who can vote, who can't vote. As I said, felon disfranchisement was sort of added to the mix in 1868 in a conscious attempt to keep black people from voting. There are very real economic reasons to do that, but I think we shouldn't overlook the sort of fundamental ideological impasse that a lot of white Southerners would have faced in this moment. I think from their perspective, these are people who quite literally had been slaves only 3 years before, right? The idea that these people would be citizens and then voters is a sort of remarkable shift. And that goes to the radicalism and the possibilities of Reconstruction. How much is suddenly on the table that a handful of years before had been simply inconceivable for large swaths of the American population. So I'm not sure I really answered the question in any useful way, but it's a great question. So it's sort of,
It is a great question, and just to add what Professor Prince was saying, or maybe to even supplement it, there's a reason why African Americans were such enthusiastic members and leaders in the Knights of Labor. And if you look at the membership of the Knights of Labor advocated the cooperative commonwealth. There's a reason why so many African Americans joined the National Farmers Alliance, or the Colored Farmers Alliance. The Colored Farmers Alliance in the late 1880s, 1890s advocate cooperation. They understand that competition is part and parcel of the free market economy, but what they're trying to point out is that if you only base an economy on competition, you're going to have exploitation. There's no way around that. And you're always going to make racial difference a highlight of that society. I mean, the idea of racial capitalism is the idea that capital creates difference. If you look at a steel town in Pittsburgh, 1890s, the Irish are accused of lowering the wage scale for the English. 2 or 3 years later, the Lithuanians are encouraged or are blamed for lowering the wage scale of the Irish. Years later, Jewish immigrants are accused of lowering the wage scale. And you see this violence. In fact, there's a lot of popular labor cartoons from the 1890s and early 1900s, which show managers quite explicitly manipulating ideas of racial and ethnic difference to keep people divided. That's where the incentive of continuing these ideas of racial and ethnic difference continue to really plague our society. I'll also connect that to how many here have had the chance, how many folks have had the chance to visit, to go to Montgomery, Alabama to see the Equal Justice Initiative's new museum. From slavery to mass incarceration. It's an amazing museum, and it tries to address some of these questions that have been posed tonight about why we abolished slavery supposedly in 1865, we supposedly got rid of Jim Crow, why the continued exploitation? And Equal Justice Initiative is, originally a team of really cutting-edge lawyers who are really dedicated to defending and helping people, helping exonerate people who've been wrongly put on death row, first initially in Alabama. And the argument there, I think, is that, mass incarceration now is such an incredibly profitable institution that, again, ideas of racial and ethnic difference are used to perpetuate this burgeoning prison system. It's never been seen in human history that such a large per capita percentage of a nation's population has been incarcerated. Much higher than the former Soviet Union, much higher than China or any other nation you would tend to think of as repressive. I'm not comparing us to those societies, I'm just saying that it's shocking that mass incarceration is such a thing, but again, the ideas of racial and ethnic difference are often deployed to say why we need these big institutions, right? Why so many people in prison?
I just want to add for the students in the room, especially anyone who hasn't seen David Duarnay's film, 13th. It's a documentary. I assume people have seen this. If you haven't checked it out, it's streaming on Netflix. But I mean, the 13th, and the title refers to the 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery, except in the case of conviction for crime, which carries it from Reconstruction to the present day, the mass incarceration crisis, in a remarkably, about an hour and a half, a very entertaining film. So it's an intro to all of these issues. I think that's a great thing to watch.
All right, we have one final round of applause for our panel. On behalf of the issue department, I'd like to thank you all for coming in. This has been wonderfully